and thank you for joining us today. I'm Donna Frazier, Vice President of Kaeru. The annual CARU Conference has always been a day full of informative, fun, and interesting panels, but obviously in person. Obviously, our conference, like so many others, has gone the way of COVID. So here we are, kicking off the CARU Virtual Conference Series, which will indeed remain informative, fun, and interesting. Before we get started, as you can imagine, it takes a village to turn our in-person conference into a webinar series. That village includes my CARU staff, our marketing and communications team, and last but certainly not least, our ever-reliant IT team, so I'd like to thank all of them. I'd also like to thank Director Andrew Smith from the FTC and Alice Cohen for remaining flexible and accommodating what for many of us is becoming our new normal. Before I get started, I'd like to thank our many generous sponsors: Google, Microsoft, Super Awesome, Keller & Heckman, Hypershift Technologies, Venable, Manat Phelps & Phillips, Baker Hostetler, and Davis & Gilbert. I'd like to now briefly introduce our featured speaker, Andrew Smith, who is director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection. He came to the FTC from the law firm of Covington & Burling, where he co-chaired the Financial Services Practice Group. Early in his career, Mr. Smith was a staff attorney at the FTC, where he led the agency's efforts to make several rules under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Mr. Smith has written extensively on consumer protection and financial services issues, served as the chair of the American Bar Association's Consumer Financial Services Committee, and is a fellow of the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers and the American Bar Foundation. Our moderator today is Alice Cohen, one of CARU's esteemed academic advisors. Alice is a social responsibility, children's media, and education executive experienced in creating and managing projects that contribute to positive social change. Her experience includes Turner Broadcasting's Cartoon Network, where she created content and projects that drove ratings and increased audiences' skill levels, reversed negative youth and adult attitudes about youth brands, and built effective partnerships with policymakers, as well as with industry, education, advocacy, and community-based organizations. Among her many achievements at Turner, Alice founded the award-winning Stop Bullying, Speak Up project, which is now embraced globally by the network. Early in her career, Alice was head of PBS's children's programming, responsible for acquiring the network's highest rated and most profitable youth series, such as Barney, Arthur, and Teletubbies. Years later, she served as group president of television, film, and video at Sesame Workshop. So I think she's more than capable of moderating this conversation for us with Director Smith. So Alice, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks. That was scary hearing about all the things you've done. It feels like a long time ago. Anyway, thank you so much. And Director Smith, thank you for spending this time with us. Hold on, I'm going to try to figure out how to start my webcam. Great. Okay, so now that you're looking at my Corona hair, you can see why I'm using that headshot from 1958. That was me on my puffy bicycle without, without the little training wheels, I have to say. But I use that headshot for a reason, because when we think about how media has changed, we know a lot more now about how to keep kids safe than we did when television was, or children's television began in the industry. So not unlike bicycle helmets, not unlike the seatbelts that we all almost involuntarily put on, our thoughts about keeping kids safe, about providing them with not only the tools, but the rules that guide the development of content and the distribution of that content have certainly shifted over the years. And the industry has changed. Many of us grew up when there was just Saturday morning television. We have so many more, someone's making tea, I just heard that. We have so many, kids have so many more options for television now than they did. So that television is now, it's not a question now of when is the show I want to watch on. The show you want to watch is always on. The game you want to play is always there. That was not the case. So the challenges for those of us on the social responsibility side and the regulatory side are different, even though the content is the same. If I could ask who's ever making that really, despite all those changes, we're still facing some of the same dilemmas. So over the last 100 years, The regulatory framework has changed, the content framework, the distribution framework has changed, but we're still facing some of the same issues, and that major issue is we want our kids to be engaged, we want them to be entertained, we also want them to be safe. So Andrew, I'd love to turn it over to you to talk briefly about the regulatory framework and some of the recent decisions that you've been challenged with.
Okay, thanks, Alice. First, my standard disclaimer that I speak only for myself, not for the commission or for any individual commission. And in terms of the regulatory framework, folks probably know this, but Federal Trade Commission is the nation's primary consumer protection agency. Federal Trade Commission has two missions: the competition side, Bureau of Competition, and the consumer protection side, which is the Bureau of Consumer Protection. And we have probably about 450 people dedicated to the consumer protection mission, and we have a lot of ground to cover. We cover marketing practices and advertising practices and financial practices and a variety of oddball rules that you've never heard of before, and we also have this important privacy function that we fulfill. And a part of that privacy function, and privacy is big for us. It's basically everybody in the world who's not a telecommunications company or a bank, and we enforce we have organic authority to prohibit unfair and deceptive acts or practices, and that's where most of our privacy enforcement and data security enforcement lives. We also enforce some very specific statutes. One of those is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which you heard about earlier. That was sort of my first love was the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that, 20 years ago, I was working on that. We also enforce COPPA, which is interesting because COPPA is, COPPA has been around a long time. That's one of the, I think the themes for this was to be one of the themes for this conference was that, I forget exactly when COPPA was enacted, but it's more than 20 years ago, right? So what we're talking about is sort of a proto-privacy law. And COPPA has been an important priority for the FTC since its enactment, and it will continue to be an important priority. It's not going to stop because of the pandemic. In fact, it's even become more urgent because of the pandemic, because kids are spending so much more time online and in front of screens than they did before. So we brought two of our largest COPPA cases ever last year. That was a case against Musical.ly and our case against YouTube, which resulted in a $170 million penalty. Both of those were, I think, broke new ground for completely different reasons. The Musical.ly case, for me there, the headline in Musical.ly was that this was a service that was offered ostensibly to people who weren't kids, but it turned out to be very appealing to kids. And that became became obvious relatively quickly, including so much so that there were newspaper articles written about how it appealed to kids and how predators, in fact, could use the service in order to find kids. Kids would post their own content, lip syncing and the like, and they would also be able to post things like their age and where they go to school, things like that. So it was potentially scary, putting kids at risk. And so that was a case where it was a company that began life perhaps not being targeted to kids, but then it became apparent that, yes, this was a site that was very appealing to kids, and we needed to extend COPPA protections to the users of that website. YouTube was a different animal. YouTube was, obviously a big platform, considers itself to be general audience. It's user-generated content that gets posted on YouTube. And but YouTube hosted these individual channels, and the channels themselves were directed to kids. And the issue for YouTube was that YouTube knew that they were directed to kids, and YouTube was still collecting information with respect to those channels, including persistent identifiers, which are then used for behavioral advertising. How do we know that YouTube knew that these channels were directed to kids? Because it included it in its marketing materials to advertisers. It said, we are the most popular site for children ages 2 to 12. We are the new Saturday morning television. So under our COPPA rule, when you have actual knowledge like that, you are responsible for obtaining verifiable parental consent, providing notice, and doing all the other things that COPPA requires you to do. The other thing about COPPA was that a lot of these channels had their own websites. So you look at child-directed content, let's say, for example, Peppa Pig. So on Peppa Pig's own organic website, Peppa Pig cannot drop cookies and use those for behavioral targeting. That would violate COPPA. So when Peppa Pig has a channel on YouTube, we have to treat that the same way. And that was another issue that was motivating our action with respect to YouTube. But YouTube was, I think, a watershed for that reason, holding a platform responsible for COPPA compliance. It also was a bit of a watershed because it was just a huge penalty. I mean, in terms of in privacy land, $170 million is a shocking amount of money. I don't think anyone, we have a $5 billion order against Facebook, but absent that, $170 million that's actually paid is a lot of money, and more than privacy regulators throughout the world have gotten in the past. I think we need to do it for that reason because of the civil penalties. I would say that the amount is large because the company is large, but the commission has actually given a lot of thought to civil penalties, and our goal in the YouTube case was to deprive YouTube of its ill-gotten gains. And so the $170 million was based on an estimate of how much they actually made from the behavioral advertising, and then it was a multiplier was added for to account for the likelihood of detection. And that was said in the statement by commissioners in connection with the YouTube settlement. So I think that the approach that we take to civil penalties is the same in YouTube. It just happens to result in a really big number. And we do have more COPPA cases on the way, and including civil penalty cases. So it's going to continue to be a big priority for us. I would say, though, that COPPA is about more than just enforcement. For me, so I've been doing this consumer protection stuff for more than 20 years now, both in private practice and at the FTC. And, and there's some consumer protection problems that just have to be solved with cracking heads. Like we bring a lot of fraud cases every year, and that just requires us to sue more and more people because they're not going to get the message otherwise. But COPPA, these are responsible companies who want to do right, and the COPPA rule is very complicated, in my humble opinion, as someone who's practiced in this area for a long time. I think that the COPPA rule, companies are earnest, and most companies, I think, and they want to get it right, but it's hard to get right. So what do? First, we do a lot of research and development. We do a lot of workshops and outreach. As everyone on this call knows, undoubtedly you've certainly watched but also participated in many workshops that we've done, which leads to regular rule updates and guidance. We're involved in an updating process of the rule right now, as folks on the call probably know. So, this is a fast-changing area of sort of culture and technology. 20 years ago, kids weren't uploading photos and videos. So, within about 10 years ago, we added photos to the definition of personal information. That's just an example of the kinds of updates that we've engaged in. We do a tremendous amount of business education. We have a hotline that businesses can send emails to, and we respond to those. We've done more than 100 FAQs. We're in the process of updating those. We may, in fact, have published the update online by this point. I don't know. A lot of business guidance materials. And like I say, in the hotline, we've responded to more than 1,000 calls. We do a lot of consumer education, a lot of public speaking and outreach like this. We do warning letters, so we've had a lot of success, particularly with non-U.S. apps, which would be very hard to reach from a law enforcement perspective. We've had a lot of success sending warning letters to the app stores, getting those apps taken down. And of course, we have the safe harbors, like the Kaeru safe harbor, which is, we're big believers in self-regulation, and we've approved, although in COPPA's case, it's a little unusual because these safe harbors are actually a creature of statute, which is something that you don't always see. But we've approved 7 companies to administer safe harbor programs. We now begin, as of I think 2013, we require them to file annual reports with us, and we believe that their membership covers hundreds of websites and apps. That's what the annual reports reveal. And the Safe Harbor programs have uncovered dozens of issues, of COPPA issues, and required companies to correct them. So Safe Harbor programs, I think, if they're working properly, are an important part of the COPPA story because it allows companies to take this very complicated statutory scheme and operationalize it, hopefully relatively easily.
Right.
And I'd be happy to talk more about safe harbors. I know this is an issue that Donna cares a lot about,
Right.
of course.
Andrew, before we move on, just to go back to the YouTube fine, the shift in responsibility, has now been shifted to creators. So whether parents care or don't care that creators can't monetize content, it doesn't, from my reading, seem to get a lot of traction with the audience. But did the creator / influencer, the reaction of that community, did that surprise you?
We knew that that was coming, I think, and we have, and the creators have always been subject to COPPA. So, what's new about this is that the platforms like YouTube would have argued that they weren't subject to COPPA, and we disagreed for the reasons I stated. Right. But the creators have always been subject to COPPA, and certainly on they had their own organic websites. I mean, this has always been an individual channel on YouTube. We have always said is a portion of a website, and if that is directed to children, then that's an online service directed to children, and it would be subject to COPPA. So, I think though that what has happened with the YouTube settlement is that YouTube has imposed some new obligations on content creators, for example, to self-identify whether they're child-directed or not. And I think that because these new rules that YouTube is imposing may affect the amount of money that that content creators can make, that's going to be a big deal. And so we're very sensitive to, our goal is to primarily to put parents in the driver's seat, and like you said, to provide kids with a safe space and families with a safe space. But we also want to make sure that parents and children aren't deprived of innovative content. So that's something that we're considering in this rulemaking. We did get, this is only one of the issues of to this rulemaking that we're engaged in, which I've referred to a couple of times. This issue of user-generated content is only one of several issues that we're considering, but we did receive 170,000 comments. More than that, actually, which is, of course, very unusual. That's a lot of comments, and they are very thoughtful comments, and we're carefully considering them. So there are obviously important issues that are at stake in this rule review.
Right. Hey, Andrew, I've got a quick question for you. You said earlier, when the original COPPA regulation was formed, kids weren't uploading photos. They weren't uploading anything to the internet. The technology was very different. How do you work, or how does your office work to kind of get ahead of that, to understand what the next steps in technology might be, so that the regulatory framework evolves with the technology? Is that even possible? Or is it more of a reaction to where the industry goes?
Looks like it's Google.
Well, it would always be nice to anticipate. I think that it is, we do a lot of what I refer to as R&D.
Chrome web browser, or
so this might be, workshops or roundtables. In December 2017, for example, we did a workshop on EdTech, and we're still working through some of the EdTech issues. That EdTech is also a subject of the rulemaking that we're currently working on. So I would say that sort of R&D helps us. People in the marketplace, companies, as well as privacy advocates and consumer advocates, and there are obviously several organizations that are very focused on protection of children online, and they also regularly, we meet with them regularly, and when new issues arise that they're concerned about, they never hesitate to tell us about them. So, I mean, we keep up to date through sort of keeping our ear to the ground, doing research, conducting workshops, but also engaging in the community and in the privacy community and the children's advocacy community to make sure that we understand and are able to ideally spot risks to children before they become a real issue.
Right. Again, going back to one of your comments, because kids have literally been online a lot more over the last 3 months, not only is there entertainment online, their school is online. Has the recent increase and recent dependence on online schooling and use of online platforms as kind of providing information around everything impacted your thinking about kids' privacy online?
Okay.
Well, I think that the schooling online is something that is, and that's not a new issue, but it is an issue that obviously is much more acute now, and is much in the questions, the concerns are now much more broadly applied. So I think that the big issue is ed tech operators and what kind of consent is required in order for them to provide the services to the schools that they need to provide, and often they need to collect information in order to provide these educational tools, and particularly if it's an interactive kind of a tool. So we have, within the last month, we published, actually it's probably about 6 weeks ago, it's the middle of April, we published a blog post directed at ed tech operators, reminding them about their COPPA responsibilities during coronavirus. We'll continue to monitor this area and provide guidance where we need to ensure that schools are able to make innovative ed tech services available to the students while protecting privacy. So our commissioners have said that, particularly where a lot of these services are being provided for free to schools and to parents. Our commissioners have said that, look, it's important that we not interfere with this innovation, but we still do need to protect privacy and make sure that people are observing COPPA and they're not, for example, collecting information and using it beyond the bounds of any consent that's been given.
Right. I really appreciated your comment about wanting to protect kids and create that safe space, but also wanting the industry to continue to innovate. So given your comments and the theme of the conference, do you have any advice for marketers who want to reach children in a safe but novel or innovative way?
Well, I mean, I think that, unfortunately, we're not really in the business of providing advice to marketers. I would say that we do have detailed FAQs. We regularly post blogs. There might be some kernels there that you can tease out. Typically, we're focused on making sure that people are complying with the law, not necessarily providing advice on how you can innovate in this space in a manner that's consistent with the law. Although we do have, like I say, FAQs that may be helpful to answer specific questions that marketers may have.
I'm going to interject here for a second with a question for you, Andrew, which is, I'm sure a lot of people on the call are curious to know your thoughts on the federal privacy law, and more importantly, whether or not that law would fold COPPA into it, or does COPPA and HIPAA and other such laws remain separate and apart from federal privacy law? And what is the FTC's role if there is a federal privacy law?
Well, so there's a lot there. There are several privacy legislation proposals for privacy legislation. I'm not a legislative person. There are probably folks on the call who have a better sense of whether or not there's anything that's likely to be enacted. I have read, just in the newspaper like everybody else, that it's increasingly unlikely that anything will be enacted this year. The proposals that I have seen often do include kids and expansions, perhaps of. I haven't seen any proposals that actually would subsume COPPA or fold it into a new law. I have seen proposals that might amend COPPA, for example, by expanding the age, the protected age group beyond 12 and under. With respect to the role of the FTC, I obviously am going to be a little bit parochial in my viewpoint, but I think that the FTC has really done actually a quite remarkable job with privacy over the last 20 plus years. So, I mentioned the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which the FTC has been enforcing and administering since the day it was enacted. The Fair Credit Reporting Act was enacted in 1970, so it's 50 years old. We have 50 years of experience with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is at its base a privacy legislation, a privacy law. So, I mean, with respect to agencies in the United States, with respect to agencies worldwide, the FTC practically invented privacy. I mean, I said before that we were privacy before privacy was cool. We also know how to protect consumers. So we have, our organic authority to prohibit unfair and deceptive practices is a consumer protection statute, and privacy laws are consumer protection statutes, and we have experience with balancing the need to protect consumers with, like I had said earlier to Alice, with the need to innovate and make sure that consumers have access to a wide variety of high quality and reasonably priced goods and services. We also have antitrust authority, and we know how to use it. So there are all kinds of antitrust issues that arise in the context of privacy, around data portability, network effects, use of acquired data, privacy as a non-price component of consumer welfare. All of these things are things that we understand sort of in our blood. We also have always been, when we have been given authority under privacy laws, we've always used that authority. So COPPA is a great example. We were told to write a rule, we wrote a rule. Not only did we write a rule, we regularly update and revise that rule for new changes in the market and new risks to consumers, new risks to children, as I explained earlier, as I laid out in my discussion with Alice. So we actually bring law enforcement actions. We have, I think, now 130 or so, both on the privacy and the data security side. So, all of that counsels in favor, from my perspective, of giving if there are new privacy responsibilities for a federal agency, I think that we are better equipped than anyone to handle them. But obviously, that's a decision for Congress to make.
Well, I'll pose this question to both of you with regards to the age issue. We often hear about the age of COPPA being raised, and with CCPA in California, what are your thoughts about whether or not the age should go above 13? I know, Alice, you've been dealing with this space for a long time, and we've had conversations, you and I personally, about what 13 means, why it was 13. I'd be interested to hear both of your opinions on that.
Yeah, I'm almost afraid
so Alice, why don't you start on that one, because...
Yeah, well, given the names I see on the call, from Helen Bohm to Arthur Pober, there's people who know a lot more than I do, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts in the question boxes there. Look, there were good developmental reasons for the age markers, the original age markers. And the more we learn about children's developmental stages, the more I think we can remain flexible. I'm kind of on the fence at this point in my career. I fully subscribe to the Fred Rogers School of Child Development, that despite children's facility with technology, the 5-year-old of today has many of the same emotional needs, or most of the same emotional needs and intellectual needs, that a 5-year-old did 20 years ago and probably 40 years ago. But that said, kids are exposed to a lot more and are interested in a perhaps broader range of topics and technologies than we even thought of, in the 1990s when this original legislation was being framed. So, I'm sorry to give a non-answer, but I think it's an open question that can be revisited. I don't have an age to pin on it right now. I'd be interested to hear if anybody in the audience does.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really helpful perspective, Alice. And of course, at the FTC, I'm a lawyer. It's a law enforcement agency. We don't necessarily have the expertise to determine what is the right developmental age to make the cut. I will say, though, from a law enforcement perspective, right now, one of the challenges for COPPA, for me at least, has been that you have no idea who the users of your online service or your app are. Only what information you can collect from them. So we rely on the fact that this idea that if the service is directed to children, then the person on the other end of the line is a child. So if it's a service directed to children, then you need to, which means it's targeted at children, then you need to include the COPPA protections. You need to get verifiable parental consent. You need to give privacy notices. You need to have data security, the rest of it. So let's say we raise the age from 12 and under to 16 and under. I have a pretty good sense of what kind of content would appeal to a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 6-year-old. And that's probably pretty different than the content that would appeal to a 25-year-old. However, I'm not so sure about the difference between content that would appeal to a 16-year-old and content that would appeal to a 25-year-old. So, there may not be that much of a difference there. So that's something that the commission hasn't taken any position on it. We haven't been asked to take any position on it. But it is something that I'm concerned a little bit about. And I do hear that in Europe, the age has migrated upward, but it also is different in different jurisdictions. In some places it may be 14, it may be 15, it may be 16, and that makes it very difficult for marketers as well. So I would be interested to know, Alice, if you have any thoughts on, and if anyone else on the call has any thoughts on this idea that there's a big difference between a 10-year-old and a 25-year-old, maybe not so much between a 16-year-old and a 25-year-old. Not developmentally, mind you, right? I think that's an important distinction, but in terms of what content would appeal to that individual.
Yeah, I think it's hard to make a generalization. If you're, and it depends on the topic. But I think there's, just from a vocabulary standpoint, from a cognitive understanding standpoint, you could have a 25-year-old who's really interested in trains, let's say, really interested in engines. You could have a 10-year-old who's really interested in engines as well. Their ability to comprehend the, sort of the economics, the engineering, the everything about that are going to be different based on their experiences. I think
right.
a good amount of, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. Well, no, you didn't. I interrupted you. We have had that issue, though, for a long time. There is sort of what I'll call family-friendly content that appeals to a wide range of ages. Think about, well, trains is an example, the moon landing, the I Have a Dream speech. These are things that might appeal to someone who's in the COPPA sweet spot, as well as a 54-year-old man like myself. So this is not. So that we have dealt with that, and we deal with that through sort of mixed, our mixed audience idea. But I think that the, if you have content that is, if we're trying to determine if content is directed to a 16-year-old, I don't know how easy that would be to do. But maybe there also is another construct too. And some of these laws that would change the regulation of children's privacy or expand it are really much more about, not so much about information collection as about making sure that kids have a safe space and appropriate content served up to them and the like.
No, and I think that's the point. In sort of a lot of bad planning, I have an 18-year-old and a 40-year-old child. There are lots of things interests that they share, but they're vastly different people with vastly different capabilities. When they were younger, there was always that balance. I'm sorry, this is one of those horrible N of 2 conversations, but there are their ability to comprehend and their ability to make sense of and act upon and be influenced by was always very different. I think your point of the difference between a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old or a 16-year-old and a 25-year-old, you could parse those numbers forever. At some point, you need to look at, and I think this is what's happened, you look at the developmental information, you look at the content, and you make a call based on what it is we know children are capable of learning and doing based on what they've seen on the screen or what they're playing with on the screen. So again, I don't have enough of that. I don't want to, I'm not ready to put an age group on it.
Right. So based on that, how has 12 and under worked, though?
You know, from my standpoint, from the industry, you know, from my perspective, it works well. But there's the, you know, there's the funny moniker of programming for 6 to 12-year-olds. You know, we all know, anybody who's got kids or spent time with kids knows there's a vast difference between a second grader and a fifth grader, or a second grader and a sixth grader. But there's content and language and pacing and that do appeal to that elementary school age group. And I think that's where that original moniker came from. When your kids are in elementary school before they get into middle school or junior high school and beyond, there are certain sort of safety parameters that we as parents, we as educators, put on that age group of child. So that's where, you know, from my standpoint, 12, I don't see a need to move it beyond 12.
I would tend to agree. This is Donna. I would tend to agree with you, Alice. I think part of the issue is exactly what you said, which is the 6 to 12, right? We know kids want to age up. So a 12-year-old does not want anything to do with a 5 or 6-year-old, right? They actually want to be aging up to the teenagers with regards to content and environment. I think the challenge, and I pose this to both of you, the challenge is the environment that all these children are consuming media, right? They're all consuming it in a very similar fashion. With regards to the Children's Television Act, with regards to where we are today with viewing on YouTube and other platforms, is that part of the challenge? Is that part of the problem? Does it matter how they're viewing?
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, I don't think, I mean, what we're talking about with CAPA, which is obviously my department, is online services. So how they're viewing, whether it's, you know, on the internet, over a mobile device, on an app, it's all an online service. And if it's directed to children, then CAPA is going to apply. From a law enforcement perspective, the tricky part is the coverage part of CAPA. But you know, am I in the soup? But if your content is directed to children, then it's a fairly easy determination for us to make, I think. And whether it's, you know, I suppose that we might get into an issue eventually with respect to like over-the-top TV, and that's something that we actually thought about in the context of the YouTube enforcement action, is that there may be media delivery channels right now that we don't necessarily think of as online services, but that really will be. So, you know, if there is over-the-top or connected TV that is collecting information about individual users, and the content on that channel is child-directed, then I think that could be a CAPA issue. And so when we think about, you know, the YouTube order, we have been thinking about a very broad application of, you know, who are the other people beyond YouTube to whom these rules might apply. And I think it's more than just, you know, user-generated content, websites, and apps.
Allison, you want to chime in on that? Otherwise, I have a question.
And I would be approaching it from a content standpoint, and the thing that comes to my mind is cooking shows.
How to get this?
We know the appeal of cooking shows to, you know, literally 8 to 80-year-olds. But the cooking show you would produce for an elementary school audience would be vastly different than one you did for a general audience or an audience over the age of 16. You wouldn't use sharp knives. You wouldn't have an open flame. There are a host of pure safety issues that would guide the content depending on the audience. So it was the only analogy I could think of that made sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we do have a question. Historically, nearly all enforcement has been against publishers in the COPPA space, the one exception being the OAuth AOL case in 2018. Do you think the COPPA obligations have been understood by advertisers, and do you see more focus on advertisers in COPPA investigations?
So I don't know whether COPPA is well understood by advertisers. I would say that the cases that I can think of that we have brought recently, and the cases that I know of in the pipeline, are focused on the people who are providing the content directly to children. So I don't think. I know that there's language in the COPPA rule that was intended to get at things like ad networks, and I think that that's hard unless the advertiser has actual knowledge. And so it's getting information from the child-directed website with actual knowledge. There's going to be COPPA liability there. I would say that that's probably not the primary focus of our COPPA enforcement. If we saw one of those cases, we wouldn't hesitate to bring it, but we're generally focused on the people who have who are directly touching the user and collecting the information directly from the user.
Do you think in general that there needs to be more education in the ecosystem, whether it's with advertisers, content creators, consumers, with regards to COPPA? I've often said that, we have 7 COPPA safe harbors in the country. We collectively represent, I would say, less than 15% of industry, right? Which means that either businesses have taken it upon themselves to undergo COPPA compliance internally, don't know about COPPA, or have joined a safe harbor.
Yeah, so more education is always.
Do you think that there's?
No, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would say more education is always better. I feel as though we're doing our part. We are spending actually a lot of resources and time on education, both FAQs, but also, but also serious outreach to industry groups, to consumer groups, and we have, and through the blog posts and things like this. So, any way to get that educational message out is great. I do think that there is, one of the things that this issue with the YouTube content creators has demonstrated is that there may not be a wide understanding of COPPA among a lot of smaller companies. And so to the extent that we can educate them, we need to do that. And if folks have ideas about other channels that we can get our message out, we'd be happy to hear it. So like I said at the top of the call, I view COPPA, our primary goal with respect to COPPA is fostering compliance. And in an area like COPPA, I think that the real challenge to fostering compliance is to, basically just notifying companies of the rule and its obligations, because I think that most companies in this space are going to be well-meaning and interested in compliance, and and where they fall down on the job, and we've seen this in some of our enforcement actions, where they fall down on the job isn't sort of for lack, it isn't because it's intentional, it's that they don't really understand the scope of the law and the requirements of the law. And so, yeah, more education is always better, and in an area like COPPA, I think it's especially needed.
I agree with you that I think in my experience, companies who don't know just don't know what they don't know, right? And in Kaeru's experience over the 20 plus years that we've been in the space and working as a safe harbor, I think we've done over 200 plus COPPA cases, and I would say 99.9% of those companies are unaware of COPPA when we come to them, right? So there's clearly an opportunity for us as an organization and the FTC and the other safe harbors, I would call, to the table to actually, find a way for us to educate the space even more. I do have a question for you though about what's the responsibility of the platforms like Apple, like Google, where in some respects they may be tying the hands of content creators, they may be tying the hands of advertisers. However, it's their platforms that are making all of these games and apps and everything available. Should they be doing more? What should they be doing? Should they be educating the space?
Well, I do think that they should be educating. I mean, ultimately, what the YouTube case shows is that we're going to hold platforms responsible, particularly when they have actual knowledge of kid-directed content on their site. So to that extent, what YouTube is doing with respect to, YouTube, our order requires YouTube to actually ask content creators and channel owners whether or not they are kid-directed. But YouTube also has said that it is employing algorithms in order to determine, to review websites and spot those that might possibly be kid-directed, looking at a variety of different variables. So, I think that, they see it as their responsibility to police their, to police their website. And we see it as their responsibility to police their website, particularly with respect to COPPA. And I think education is an important part of that. And first and foremost, educating content creators that, look, if you're child-directed, then it's very important that you not be collecting information from users except in a manner that complies with COPPA.
So I think my challenge or concern about the Google YouTube case is putting the onus on content creators to determine whether or not their product is child-directed, when we've just said that we understand that most content creators probably don't know whether or not they're COPPA compliant. So I have to presume that they don't know.
No, but I didn't say
what
that.
Child-directed actually means.
I don't believe that. I think that, so what I'm talking about is if your site, if your content is targeted to children, I mean, you know who your audience is, and you know who you're targeting with your audience. Now, if it's not targeted to children, I don't know what's the specific question that YouTube is asking the content creators. Maybe you all do, or somebody on the conference does. But you know who, if you're a content creator, you know who you're trying to appeal to. And if it's people who are, between under the age of, who are 12 and under, then you need to answer that question truthfully. It's not a question of, the question isn't, do you comply with COPPA? The question is, who is your audience?
No, I think that's a really good point. I'm sorry, I got booted off there for a while. And full disclosure, I have consulted with YouTube Kids and continue to sit on one of their advisory boards. But their Creator Academy, which offers in-depth information about not only child development, but how to create content for children, is available not only to their current creators, but to anybody who wants to log on to that free website. So, and knowing the people who participated in creating that information, it's many of the same folks who've had deep and broad experience in the children's media field over the last 20 years. So the information is there, and I think, Andrew, I think you raise a good point. There seem to be two things here. There's the understanding of the regulation, and then there's the understanding of how to create content that's developmentally appropriate and age appropriate for the target audience. So the education that needs to happen is along both fronts. It's not enough to know one or the other. Creators, especially in this environment, need to know both.
Yeah.
Great. So we have another question. Obviously, we know that the COPPA rule review is underway, and we're all eagerly awaiting the analysis. But one of the questions is that there are some clear technical areas where the law seems out of date. For example, allowing SMS or messaging as a channel to obtain consent from parents rather than just email, or allowing digital signatures for parent verification. Is there a way for the FTC to allow modernizing these mechanics without waiting for the full rule review?
So I don't know whether these are, we outlined in our request for information the topics, potential topics for the rule review. And I don't know if, the channel for obtaining consent or the mechanism of the signature is something that we're looking at or not. And I hope we did get, like I say, 170,000 comments. So plus, I think 175,000. So hopefully folks raised these issues. They do seem to me, it does seem to me, this is the type of change that we would typically consider, particularly if we think that there's, that there's a need to change the rule to accommodate new technology, or that these can sort of affect the purposes of the statute more easily for parents. So that's something that we would definitely look at. I don't know whether we are or not. And I would say that any kind of rule review, I don't anticipate us doing this piecemeal. So for example, if this type of a change, the digital signature, if that requires a rule change, I wouldn't anticipate that we would do, one little rule change not in the context of this broader rule review. But I also don't want to imply that a rule change would be needed. So, a digital signature for parent verification strikes me just at first blush as though the type of thing that parents are probably already doing, given that these are online services. So I'm not sure how a digital signature for parent verification would differ from what people currently do under the rule. But I'm interested in hearing more. So I have not heard that that's something that we're specifically going to consider, nor have I heard that we are thinking of moving any parts of the rule review faster than other parts.
Okay, great. Do either of you have any closing comments? Alice, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, at the risk of sounding hopelessly naive, I think the majority of the folks in the kid business want to do good and do well. And if we look at our business historically, this is an issue we will continue to wrestle with no matter what happens. We have been challenged with new technology and regulations since the Nickelodeons of the early part of the 20th century. I believe some of the first regulation were around radio programs for kids in the 1920s. And we faced it again when radio shifted to television, and then again when television shifted to the online environment. And, I think this kind of dialogue is critical, and I would only hope, and it was great to hear Andrew talk about the outreach that you're doing. I would hope that outreach would continue and grow broader on both parts, on the industry's part as well as on the FTC's part. Because the more folks know about how to do this business right, the more we do good and do well for our audience.
Yeah, so I would say that I think that our basic goals are all pretty much the same, that we all want a world where parents and kids can have a safe place where parents can provide a mobile device to a child with confidence that they're not going to be served up inappropriate content, or that information isn't going to be collected from them and abused, and or that they're not going to be served up inappropriate ads or served up ads based on their online behavior, which is now our rule currently prohibits. So I think we're all roughly in that same space, but we want to continue to encourage, as I said earlier, innovative, creative, educational content for kids, to the extent that we're able to do that with our rule. So this rulemaking project that we're engaged in now has been, it's been a long time in the making. As I said, we did a workshop on ed tech in December of 2017. So we've been given this, we have given this a great deal of thought over a long period of time. We now have a lot of comments that we need to review. These comments reflect a broad range of ideas and viewpoints. But our top priority is to, when we come out of this rulemaking, is to ensure that parents remain in the driver's seat when it comes to the collection and use of their child's personal information, and that children continue to have access to high quality products and services. So, like I said, that is our ultimate goal.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate both of you taking time out today. This would have been nicer if we were all in person in Los Angeles, but hopefully next year we'll get there. I appreciate the work that both of you do, and Kaeru, obviously Alice, we value as an academic advisor, and Director Smith, Kaeru continues to want to work with the FTC as a COPPA safe harbor on educating the entire ecosystem about COPPA, about children's content, about keeping children safe online. So as you said, I think we're all like-minded in our mission. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, I want to thank all of our sponsors that you see on the screen, and our next webinar will be on Tuesday, June 23rd at 2 p.m. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Please stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.